Yeah. I'd like to move on a little bit and talk about COVID and the role the outbreak played and continues to play actually in China's actions in Hong Kong and what the local government is doing. This all took place. The national security law took place. The protests ended after, when COVID started. And then this became this kind of, train that just kept moving that, through its own force. And now we see even, further tightening of the grip on Hong Kong because of COVID. Can you talk a little bit about that? You mentioned that in the book. It's sort of this cover under which a lot of this was able to occur, right?
Yeah, again, I think we have to wait a little longer to see how this plays out, but it's almost like if COVID didn't exist, they would have had to invent it for Hong Kong. It's been a very, very convenient pretext to arrest people. The June 4th commemorations, which went on for 30 years, ended in 2020, and that's one of the reasons Jimmy Lai is in jail right now. It's one of the offenses he's been convicted for, is that he lit a candle all by himself and didn't call for anybody to do anything, but that was regarded as taking part in a demonstration, which had been outlawed. And one reason that people couldn't demonstrate was because you couldn't have more than 4 people because of COVID. So there's just, reason after reason that people can't take part politically because of COVID. I think there's the kind of, that's the kind of short-term thing. I think the bigger picture, and something that's going to be with us much longer, is the kind of techno surveillance that has been rolled out. And it's obviously, much more advanced in China. And of course, in places like Xinjiang, where they've got facial recognition and other ways of, looking at people's walk, their gait, to, pick people out of a crowd. So it's been very interesting because this is a kind of real life, real time test of the surveillance methods that China is trying to impose on its people and on Hong Kong. And I think there's been interesting resistance from Hong Kong. I mean, it's funny, and there's resistance to vaccinations. One reason Hong Kong can't open up is that people don't want to be vaccinated because they don't trust the government. It's funny, I talked to some of my friends there and they say, why should I get vaccinated? There's no COVID and I don't trust the government anyway. I should also say the fact that they're using the Chinese vaccine, Sinovac, is, which isn't as effective, doesn't help. But I talk to people in Hong Kong who don't want it. They won't take their phone when they go out. They only want to use cash. They don't want to use their octopus card because you don't want to be tracked. Because if you and I, for example, had lunch in a restaurant, Jodi, and somebody, 5 tables over tested positive, until about a week ago, they would they'd throw us in, I was going to say a concentration camp, a quarantine camp at Penny's Bay. They've had to back off on that because the numbers are so big. But what they're doing is they're having lockdowns. They're basically scooping people up in Hong Kong as they do in the mainland. And yes, there is you can definitely argue the science on this, but it does seem clear that they like the control part. And this is, I think, a dry run for ensuring that they can control everybody, in Hong Kong all the time, and, COVID or no COVID.
Yeah, there's certainly a strong surveillance aspect to it, correct? This Leave Home Safe app you have to use whenever you go anywhere. Yeah. Well, we've got a couple good questions. One from Pete Engardio, who says, first of all, great to see you again, Mark.
Hi, Pete.
And he says, aside from civil liberties and security, what is happening to the rule of law regarding business? Good question. And follows it up by saying, will there still be any legal advantage to being based in Hong Kong as opposed to, say, Shanghai or Shenzhen?
Yeah, Pete, great question. I can't see you on the screen, but thanks for taking part. I think that's that question is not fully answered. It's clear that there are handpicked judges who are overseeing the national security law cases, and they're engaged in lawfare. I mean, they're engaged in using the kind of veneer of rule of law to reach predetermined political ends. Now, is that going to affect commercial law? Don't know. I mean, I think it's just too early to say. I mean, there are people who are worried, right? But I don't think that we can point to. I don't know of any hard evidence that says judges are ruling in favor of a mainland cadre versus, a U.S. multinational, for example. I think it raises a question about Hong Kong's role as an international arbitration center, which, interestingly, Teresa Cheng, the current Secretary for Justice, had done a lot of work on. So it's a sad irony that she's presiding over, I just think a real assault on rule of law. I mean, beyond the national security law cases, we have 10,000 plus people who were arrested on political charges in 2019 and 2020. Only about a quarter of those have been charged. The arrests hang over people's heads. It's a kind of peculiar feature of the Hong Kong, I guess, coming out of the British legal system. So, so in other words, the overwhelming majority of the political cases are not NSL charges. My understanding from talking to people who are working with prisoners is, it still really depends on the judges. It's not as kind of black and white, we're just going to lock them all up forever as you might think. But, there's obviously people are getting longer sentences and it's harsher than it was, 5 years ago or something on kind of protest related charges. So, I guess the thing is, let's wait and see. It'd be great if somehow, you're able to keep these two tracks separate. The history of these things is pretty hard, to, have one stream for political offenses and then be completely, kind of above board and even handed on commercial disputes.
And we have a somewhat related question from Bill Holstein. Have the Chinese extended the Great Firewall of the internet to control and monitor Hong Kong's communications? I guess I'll add, do you think that will happen? And if it does, will that affect the ability of international companies to operate from Hong Kong?
Yes, and yes. I mean, just this week, we saw Hong Kong Watch has been blocked by the major internet providers in Hong Kong. Hong Kong Watch is a UK-based NGO, which Chris Patton and other, from the Chinese standpoint, undesirables are involved with. So I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, just earlier this week, their service was blocked. And I think we're gonna see that increasingly. And they'll start with NGOs, and then they'll go to more sensitive other political sites, and then they'll go to news sites, and it'll be like being in Beijing. And I guess companies somehow figure out ways to work around it, but you're in a fundamentally different business, cultural, political, social environment than you were 10 years ago. You're like Beijing, or I would argue, in some respects, you're worse than Beijing. Right now, still better because the firewall is not really, fully enforced, but I think it's inevitable that it will be.
And you think that will lead, just follow up on that, that will lead to more media companies having more challenges, so to speak, there, and perhaps doing what the New York Times has done by moving, they moved their Asia headquarters to Seoul. So. Yeah,
it's just, so look, you'll have correspondence there. I mean, it would be interesting, it'd be interesting to know if somebody with a permanent residence card in Hong Kong who they didn't want to let in, if they would still let them in as a media worker. I mean, I'm sure many of us on this call would, or, either would fall into this category or know people who would. I mean, obviously the prognosis isn't good. But it could be that basically people will just cover Beijing and Shanghai. I mean, Hong Kong will just be sort of a minor place. It's like, maybe it's like a Monaco or something where a lot of rich Chinese come, and they've, it's a nicer lifestyle, and the mountains are nice, and you can go out on your junk on the weekends, and the apartments are nice, and, the tax rate is low, and that's it. But what's happening in Monaco? I don't know how big the Bloomberg bureau in Monaco is, but it's probably smaller.
I don't think we have one.
Yeah, so I rest my case.